Hello everyone. We're going to travel back in time to ancient Rome again, tonight, and explore one of the famous aspects of Roman civilization and society, gladiator games. This practice, this form of popular entertainment, of games, in arenas specifically designed to receive large crowds. These games included combats, duels between fighters, and many more things. Wild exotic animals, the recreation of historical battles or stories from mythology in spectacular settings, all sorts of theatrical tricks and techniques, in large amphitheatres, the most famous of all being the Roman Colosseum. We're going to examine this history. How did it begin? Why? How did these games evolve along Roman history? And what did Roman society think of the practice? Who were these gladiators that could be pitted against one another? What were their odds of surviving? What was their status? How did it work behind the scenes? And what does this type of entertainment tell us of Roman society, values, or politics? We have a lot to explore. This is going to be another long dive, so please make yourself comfortable, grab a drink if you wish, or find the right position in your bed. Our journey is about to begin. As you know, you can also listen to my stories on music streaming sites and apps like Spotify or Apple Music, or if you wish to support this channel, on Patreon. Patreon is what keeps the episodes free of sponsorships and with the least possible amount of ads that YouTube will allow. As a Patreon supporter, you can also listen to all episodes ad-free as podcast episodes in two versions, voice only, like what you are listening to at the moment, or with background sounds. And you can listen either on the Patreon site or on your usual podcast app, if that's more convenient for you. You can also download all the tracks and the videos if you want to have them offline. You can join Patreon for the monthly amount you want, starting at $1, £1 or €1. And now, let's get into our story. So, when did the practice of games with gladiators begin in ancient Rome? It was certainly very ancient, but the precise origin of this phenomenon is not known. What we know is that the existence of gladiators in Italy predates the rise of Rome. Rome progressively emerged in the first millennium BC as a republic by subjugating and absorbing different peoples that lived in the south and center of Italy. And archaeology revealed that at least one of them, the Campanians, already had gladiators before Rome annexed them. Frescoes found in tombs of Campania, dating from the 4th century BC, show pairs of gladiators fighting. What is unknown is whether the tradition began in Campania or was adapted there and was more ancient than that, which is well possible. It could have been inherited from another people, the Etruscans, more to the north, or even from Greek colonists that arrived in southern Italy in the 8th century BC. This remains uncertain. But what is clearer is that gladiator fights in Campania were more associated with funerary rites than entertainment. The image we keep of Roman gladiators is the entertainment aspect. But this is probably not how gladiators began. The earlier gladiator combats may well have been first and foremost ritualistic fights that were organized to honor a dead person, to spill blood, but in a way that would avoid a sacrifice if the fight was stopped as soon as someone got hurt. The entertaining dimension could have been just a side effect of a rite, a ceremony that was funerary or religious in nature. In any case, the Campanians already had another practice that the Romans would keep. They had types of gladiators, distinguishable by their weapons and armor, and generally named, equipped, and dressed as their enemies, as enemies they had vanquished. One of the most popular of these types was the Samnite, who had a short sword, a rectangular shield, a leg protection, and a helmet. Later, the Romans would add more of these types, like the Gaul, inspired by Gallic warriors. This Gaul type later evolved into another type called the Murmillo, that had a shield on one arm and a kind of segmented arm protection on the other arm, together with a recognizable large helmet with a grille that protected their face. So it seems the Romans also inherited this practice of dressing gladiators in ways that were codified. Their gladiators belonged to certain types derived from old traditions or enemies they had conquered. And people, the audience, would know these types. These were codes that were part of the show. But we were not there yet at the beginning of Rome, and it would take centuries before real games of gladiators appeared. After subjugating the south and center of Italy, Rome began to expand overseas. With ups and downs, it was not straightforward. There was political instability and sometimes military defeats or even disasters. But despite temporary setbacks, like during the wars against Carthage, the Punic Wars, Rome always came out victorious. As these wars went on, the practice spread of honoring dead people who were seen as having had a glorious life and contributed to the success of Rome with gladiator games. These became more and more frequent and spectacular by the end of the 3rd century and the 2nd century BC. Spectacular because these celebrations to honor prominent people after their death involved more and more gladiators. For example, in 216 BC, a former consul of the Republic, that is to say, a very high elected official, Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, was honored with 3 days of celebration, involving 22 pairs of gladiators, 22 fights. The event was organized and paid for by his sons. In the following decades, there were more and more of these celebrations, and bigger. For example, in 183 BC, that is 30 years after the death of Marcus Lepidus the consul, another consul, Publius Licinus, was honored with extravagant funeral games that used 120 gladiators this time. and also included the distribution of meat to the population, which was remarkable because meat was not a frequent component of people's diet in the lower classes in Rome. So, what historians agree about is that during this period, the importance of these games increased, not only as a way of honoring the dead, but also more and more as a moment of coming together for the Romans. Ordinary people were included in these celebrations. They received food, they were entertained by the fights of gladiators. And so, from an initially funerary or religious type of rite, these games became increasingly popular festivals, popular celebrations. Their signification began to drift. And another thing, from a more political angle, is that even though these festivities were organized by the families of the defunct, they were not paid for by the state. It was private initiative. They still became part of social life and were increasingly encouraged as moments that galvanized the population. It was good for morale, especially in times of military hardships. Like in the Punic Wars, Rome came out victorious of these wars against Carthage, but not before it suffered disasters, and the city itself appeared at risk of being invaded at some point. So, festivities that boosted the population's will to fight, or even out of periods of difficulties, the population's motivation to participate in the war effort and the expansion of Rome, this was welcomed by authorities. This practice, the organization of funeral games with gladiators, spread quickly to other parts of the Republic, not just in Italy. It began in Spain or in North Africa. By the early 2nd century BC, Rome was still a long way from its peak of expansion, but it had already gotten out of Italy. And these games multiplied in every Roman city, to the point that they became relatively common by the mid-2nd century BC. Some were minor and lasted only one day. Others could last more, 3-4 days, with a banquet, dance and theatre performances, public distribution of food, and the climax of the event was the succession of gladiator fights. This practice had begun as a way of honoring the dead, and it still was by the 2nd century BC. But increasingly, these games were organized and paid for with other goals, other ideas in mind. All gladiatorial games had sponsors, organizers, also called editors. And by offering this exciting entertainment for free or at very little cost, by giving away food, these sponsors also established their status, their popularity. In a republic where you needed to have an elective office to take part in political life, this was a way of attracting voters, of gaining their loyalty. In other words, it was a way of transforming money, your personal fortune, into political influence. Only very wealthy people could afford to sponsor games that lasted several days and could involve dozens of performers, plus food and drinks for thousands. By the 1st century BC, as the Roman Republic was at the same time more successful and prosperous than ever, if you judge by its expansion and wealth, but also very unstable internally, politically and socially, This system of sponsorship of gladiator games was now well installed and was used by ambitious politicians and ambitious generals to advance their cause. They would organize lavish games, or sometimes just promise games, to gain votes from the plebeians, the ordinary free citizens of Rome, as opposed to the patricians, the old aristocratic families. Julius Caesar himself, in his rise to power, organized games like these to increase his popularity. He held games officially in honor of his dead father. In fact, his father had died 20 years earlier. It just served as a pretext to organize the games. As you see, the original religious meaning had long been put aside at this point, and games were now about entertainment, about festivities, and political influence. So Caesar organized the most grandiose games Rome had ever seen at this point, in 65 BC, with 320 pairs of gladiators. And in fact, he had even more available. But the Senate of Rome at the time put a limit of 320 pairs to the number of gladiators someone could bring to Rome. They did this because they were worried by the development of small private armies, and by the ambitions of generals and politicians like Caesar. In 65 BC, Caesar was not the glorious general he would become yet. And the Senate also took these measures because there had recently been a major revolt of slaves, the one led by Spartacus, a gladiator. So, letting too many gladiators stay in Rome at the same time looked very dangerous. Caesar took advantage of the political instability and corruption of the Republic to increase his personal power, and this trend went on with his successor, Octavian, also known as Augustus, the first ruler of what remained officially a republic, but was in fact now an empire, with emperors for life becoming the objects of an imperial cult. Augustus conquered his undisputed personal power by winning the civil war against his rivals, especially Mark Antony, allied with Cleopatra of Egypt. This is probably the best-known chapter of Roman history. And when he established the empire in 27 BC, he made a number of reforms to stabilize Rome, politically and socially. One aspect of these reforms was to expand imperial authority over the games and to formalize their provision as a civic and religious duty. So concretely, that meant no more ambitious individuals using the games to further their career in Roman politics or to prepare their little coup. Now, the organization of funerary games by the descendants of prominent people would be capped to 120 gladiators and a maximum budget of 25,000 denarii. The denarius was the currency of the Roman Republic and then the Roman Empire for several centuries. Its value evolved and went down significantly over time because authorities debased it many times, meaning that they reduced the quantity of silver in coins they issued. But for comparison, and taking this with a grain of salt, because obviously the range of products one could buy was very different 2,000 years ago. An unskilled laborer around 27 BC at the time of Augustus would be paid around 1 denarius per day. And using the price of bread as a baseline, 1 denarius would be worth around 20 to 25 US dollars of today. So 25,000 denarii, the ceiling cost of funerary games, would have been worth around $500,000. A big amount that only wealthy families could afford to spend on such a celebration, but also clearly not enough to buy or influence thousands of people. So there was a relatively low limit to what one could spend on funerary games. And apart from them, there was another type, another category of games, the ludi, that cost no less than 180,000 denarii. That is to say, close to at least $4 million this time. But a ludi had to be dedicated to the imperial cult, regardless of its funding by a private individual or by the state. This meant that instead of serving private interests, the most sumptuous and celebrated games would now serve to increase the public recognition and approval of the emperors, and by extension of the institutions of the Roman state. Together with many other initiatives by Augustus, this reform was successful at ending the constant civil wars and internal feuds that had plagued the late Roman Republic. And it started a period of relative stability that lasted until the end of the 2nd and the 3rd centuries AD. This is why, apart from his military success, and despite his ambition that made him effectively end a republic that had existed for centuries, Augustus is regarded as one of the greatest statesmen of ancient Rome. He laid the foundations of a new political and social order, system that turned out to be successful for several generations after him. And it is under this new system of games, now dedicated to the imperial cult, that gladiator games reached their peak in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries AD. They were now used by authorities, by the emperors, to buy the population's loyalty and admiration, and increasingly to buy social peace. You know the phrase bread and circuses, food and entertainment, which comes from this. These were the two main ingredients to keep the population of Rome, the masses, quiet and obedient. Not just in the city of Rome, actually, the ludi, the games that celebrated the Roman emperors, were also held around the Roman world, which now encompassed the entire Mediterranean and beyond, from Turkey to Spain, and from Britain to Egypt. In the city of Rome itself, games reached new levels of extravagance that would have been unthinkable before. For example, in 108 and 109 AD, the Emperor Trajan celebrated his victories over festivities that lasted not 3, not 4, not 5 days, but 123 days, several months. And these festivities used a reported 10,000 gladiators and 11,000 animals. And the cost of games in Rome continued to spiral out of control along the 2nd century, the peak of Roman prosperity. The games in Rome were now hosted inside the Colosseum, a huge amphitheatre built in the 1st century. We will come back to it. That reflected the growing importance of this popular entertainment at the time. At its peak, the Colosseum could hold an audience of 80,000. which is equivalent to large modern stadiums. The decline of games started only in the 3rd century, when the empire entered a period of crisis. But the games were still widely popular, and this decline was slow and complicated. The very high cost of the games was the first factor that limited them along the 3rd and 4th centuries, but they still went on. There had always been moral critics in Rome about the games, the ludi, on the grounds that they would be a sign of decadence with their lavish spending and the promotion of entertainment over hard work or traditional values. It never really stopped the games, but with the progress of Christianization, the games were increasingly criticized for their cruelty and their association with pagan sacrifices or pagan rituals, something Christianity strongly rejected. And the Christians also rejected the imperial cult the games were dedicated to, that by definition was a pagan cult to a false idol to the Christians. When Christian martyrs were sent to the Colosseum and other arenas around the Roman Empire as punishment for their rejection of Roman social and religious order, these games became an embodiment of evil to the Christians, at least the ones that included fights to the death or executions made public for the entertainment of the audience and the affirmation of imperial power. So, more and more Christian voices condemned the games. At first cautiously, because they were very popular and it was dangerous to speak against the Roman state. But with the progress of Christianization along generations, and ultimately the conversion to Christianity as the state religion, this movement that condemned the games gained strength. By the late 4th century, Emperor Theodosius adopted Christianity as the state religion and banned pagan festivals. But on the other hand, the people had to be entertained, and so other forms of festivities like theatrical shows and chariot races continued to be promoted by the authorities. We don't exactly know when they ended, but it seems gladiator games really nosedived in the 5th century. As you know, the empire remained theoretically one, but for administrative and military purposes it had been divided into 2 entities, Western and Eastern. So in the Western Roman Empire, which was the first to fall, the final dislocation of the state and the abandonment of cities in the 5th century meant that the games could no longer be organized. But even in the Eastern Roman Empire, in Byzantium, gladiators had disappeared by the mid-5th century. So, now that we have spoken of the rise and fall of gladiators, let's take a closer look at who these men were. How did they end in an arena? Why? What were these gladiator schools? Were they trained? And in general, how did things work behind the scenes? As I told you at the beginning, the earliest types of gladiators were named after Rome's enemies. There was the Samnite, the Gaul, or the Thracian. These types evolved during the Republic, that is to say, before the practice of games reached its peak. They evolved into new types. The Samnite was renamed the Secutor, whereas the Gaul, which was inspired by the Gauls that lived in northern Italy, and had now been well integrated, the goal was renamed the Murmillo. The Murmillo or Mirmillo retained the same equipment with a gladius, a short sword, a rectangular shield, an arm protection, and the typical helmet with a visor and a grille. Typically in early Roman gladiator fights, at the time exclusively for funeral games, each type of gladiator fought against a similar type. But in the later Republic and the Empire, this changed. Various new fantasy type of gladiators were introduced for variety and entertainment, novelty. For example, the retiarius, which means netman, armed with a net, a dagger, and a trident. Gladiators fighting from chariots or carts were also introduced, and other ones fighting with sorts of boxing gloves called cesti. In the 2nd and 1st centuries BC, the growing trend to organize gladiator fights gave birth to a little industry, a trade, because these gladiators had to be recruited or purchased as slaves and trained before they could be shown to the public. This trade grew exponentially when thousands of gladiators became necessary, and it became empire-wide as large cities, starting with Rome, had to be supplied with fresh fighters almost constantly. But who were these men and how were they found? It varied over time, but by the late Republic, about half of gladiators were volunteers, paid volunteers, who had chosen this career because it was well paid, or by default, or because they wanted the life that came with it. It was obviously a dangerous trade to be in, but the odds of surviving were not that bad. I will tell you about it later in more detail. Actually, the odds were not worse than when you enrolled into the armies of Rome at different periods. Entering a gladiator school as a poor person or a non-citizen was a way of finding a trade, regular food, housing, and a fighting chance of fame, and possibly a fortune if one became popular. The prize money and the gifts that gladiators could receive during the late Republic and the Empire were substantial. And in the very strict and compartmented social structure of Rome, where your birth determined a lot of your life, becoming a gladiator could give you a serious opportunity at a comfortable life and a bit of a social rise. The other half of gladiators were not volunteers. They were either prisoners of war or slaves condemned to the arena as punishment for crimes. In the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, Rome had an almost constant influx of prisoners coming from faraway provinces as the empire expanded by force. These prisoners were very good gladiators because they were already trained soldiers and they looked exotic to the Roman crowd. It was also a way of showing the Romans the importance, the extent, and the might of the empire to which they belonged. So, what was the risk of premature death for a gladiator? It was high, but way less than 50% at each fight, because not all fights were to the death. Historians have made statistics based on records and estimates. The risk of death for a defeated gladiator, that is to say, to be killed during the fight, or executed after it, because he had not fought well enough, was about 20 to 25%. 20 to 25%, assuming he had lost. So in average, when two gladiators entered the arena, each of them had a 10 to 12% chance of dying. That's frighteningly high, but we shouldn't have the image of gladiator fights always ending with the death of one of them. And it is also likely that since gladiators were expensive to feed, to equip and train, a lot of fights were actually partially or entirely staged. Like in modern wrestling, they would pretend to fight and offer a good show to the audience, but for their owners or sponsors, it was a much better business to get them back alive after the fight. Another interesting statistic is that at its greatest extent, the empire had about 400 arenas, and the total number of deaths in these arenas from combats or accidents, or including public executions, which could also take place in these arenas, was around 8,000 per year. That's 20 per year per arena. And that's at the peak of the empire, when gladiator fights were also at their peak. That's a high number, obviously, but it means that out of Rome and out of a few large cities, where there were extravagant games and hundreds could die in a year in arenas, in most cities, the death of someone in the arena was not a frequent event. It happened every few months, and entire games could take place without a single death. One last figure: the mortality rate of all gladiators who entered an arena in the 1st century AD would have been around 19 to 20%. This 19 to 20% includes all gladiators, all individuals who combated only once and survived because they were volunteers only for one fight or because they had been sentenced to a single fight, and others who fought repeatedly. Obviously, the road to fame and fortune for a gladiator came with public recognition, and it was way more dangerous than that. Gladiators had to fight multiple times and take risks to really live from this trade and retire with enough to live. And this public recognition existed only among the popular classes. Having been a gladiator, and even a glorious one, the doors of the higher classes of Roman society would still remain completely closed. The trade was not seen as worthy of social elevation. A bit like today, a popular boxer or wrestler is probably not going to enter the social circles dominated by all money. It doesn't work like this. But still, returning to mortality, a gladiator who fought well, who had a sense of stagecraft and would produce a good show, and also was on the team of a well-connected gladiator school owner, had the odds in his favor and would likely survive, either by winning the fight or by being spared in case of defeat. Actually, with the rise of games in the 1st century BC, demand for gladiators started to strongly surpass supply, and it became more important to spare their lives so that they could fight another day. The taste of the public also favored duels between well-trained fighters that were expensive, and so for that reason, under Augustus, matches to the death were forbidden. It doesn't mean nobody died anymore in the arena. There were still convicts that were thrown into the arena and pitted against wild animals as a form of execution. But a good gladiator could reasonably hope to make it. and testimonies suggest that most of the time the crowd asks for the losing gladiator to be spared, not executed. During the imperial era, some matches were publicized as sine missione, without reprieve. That is to say, they could only end with the death of one of the combatants. This could attract more people, obviously, because the stakes were higher. But the existence of these combats, the way they were publicized, also indicates that the sparing of the loser's life had become the norm at the time. We also know that at the end of a combat, when emperors attending the games in Rome were asked to spare or not a defeated warrior, they could lose popular support if they refused to spare alive. Emperors like Caligula and Claudius lost some of their popularity in the arena when they sentenced losing gladiators to death. And for emperors, losing popularity in their capital was something dangerous. A gladiator could acknowledge defeat by raising a finger, and if he did this, the editor, the sponsor of the games, would decide whether the loser was spared or not. For the sponsors, the games were organized to win over the crowd. So, more often than not, it was the crowd's reaction that determined the sparing, and it was generally in favor of the losing gladiator. It seems Roman crowds tended to be lenient. In order to provide a good show, the gladiators had to be trained, prepared, and this training took place in schools. The earliest named school that we know of is from the late 2nd century BC, but they multiplied after that due to the increased demand for gladiators. I told you that socially, gladiators had a low standing. They were infamous, that is to say, low class with a bad reputation. Socially, they were on a footing with professions like butchers or pimps. That was not a glorious trade, and they could still become rich and famous, at least a minority of them, but the social stigma would stay. However, owning gladiators and a school to train them, that was not stigmatized at all. It was well accepted, and high-class individuals could do it for the thrill, without being judged by their peers. But many schools, including all the largest, ended up being owned and operated by the state. Early on, the Roman state became involved in the control of these schools, for the reasons I told you about before, because they could serve to raise small private armies, because until the reforms of Augustus, the games in the late Republic had become marketing operations for wealthy and ambitious people, and also because of the memory of the Spartacus revolt and other slave revolts. Spartacus was a slave and a gladiator. He led the biggest and most threatening slave revolt Rome had ever seen. A revolt that inflicted defeats to Roman troops before it could be crushed. So, for these reasons, gladiator schools were seen as risky institutions that should be limited in size and regulated by the state. That's why, over time, the Roman state absorbed many of them. They became public institutions. In these schools, no real weapons were allowed. The gladiators trained with wooden versions, and their training was different from a military training. Apart from a standard physical training, they rehearsed choreographed sequences, like wrestlers do. That would guarantee the quality of the show. The fight had to last, No one wanted it to be over in 30 seconds. But if you throw two persons in an arena in a fight to death, it is probably going to be very short and disappointing. The first to wound the other is going to win, and that can happen very quickly. Also, if you have already seen real fights, not the ones we see on television or in films, these are not that elegant or exciting. They can even quickly turn ridiculous. But the average gladiator fight had to last 10 to 20 minutes. That's a long time that requires a bit of simulation and showmanship to make it entertaining. Testimonies also attest that spectators preferred to watch highly skilled fighters that were well matched and had complementary fighting styles, for example, one stronger but slower, and the other not as strong but more agile. To provide spectators with that kind of show, the fight had to be rehearsed, and even for gladiators and their trainers, a satisfactory, spectacular fight in which no one dies was a much better outcome. This is probably why most gladiators would get along most of the time and provide the show that was expected from them. Still, the trade was dangerous since they would fight with real lethal weapons, and the loser was never sure that he would be spared. He could be killed on a whim of the crowd or on a whim of the editor. So, in the gladiator school, they were also prepared to die stoically and accept this fate without begging or crying, which would have spoiled the show. Of course, to us, this way of turning death into entertainment looks incredibly cruel, not humane. Doing this to people today would be unacceptable, including for convicts that have committed blood crimes. Actually, the concept of modern gladiators that fight to the death in arenas is something that only appears in dystopian fiction, like The Hunger Games or The Running Man. This critique was not completely absent in ancient Rome, and it only grew further with Christianization. But still, these shows happened for centuries. They were very popular, perfectly legal, and actually sponsored by the states itself. So why did they happen? What does it tell us of this time and this society? First, that even though we perceive them through the filter of time, antique societies were really very harsh. The way they are depicted in fiction often shows them sanitized. But these were societies in which human life was precarious, and not as sacred as it has become in modern societies. It was precarious because of untreatable diseases or wounds, because of warfare, because of criminality. We don't have reliable crime data, but rates of homicide were way higher than they are today in the vast majority of countries. So death was very present in people's life. Life expectancy was around 40 years in average. The death penalty was a common thing, including for crimes that we would consider small. And there was probably not that perception that killing was as serious as it is today. But that's not the only reason. From the beginning, these games had a meaning and a function. A meaning that was more religious at the start. And in the 2nd and 1st centuries BC, it shifted. It became more social and political. Anthropologists have noted that all societies find ways to channel violence and ritualize it. One theory is that this is one of the bases for the establishment of justice systems, which can take different forms, but are all designed to make social life possible, to keep a society together. And this required, and still requires, rituals that are known and visible by everyone. Public executions, sacrifices, ceremonies. If we follow this theory, these would be ways of showing to all members of a society that they are part of a system that creates order and has considerable power, including over people's lives. That would have evolved from ritualized killings to courts of justice, in which obviously there is way less physical violence, but it is true that whichever past or present society you look at, you find mechanisms of ritualized, codified, channeled violence that are accepted by most. They are part of social order. And maybe this became the function of games in ancient Rome. Of course, there was the entertainment dimension to them, and they were part of festivities that also contributed to social order, with the celebration of imperial power or the distribution of food to keep the population happy. But on top of that, there were also a public staging of ritualized violence, a way of showing to all spectators that they belonged, and also to implicitly threaten them. Look what happens if you violate social order by committing crimes, or if you lose your citizenship. You could be the one ending up in the arena. So maybe these games were also a mechanism that kept society together. On a deeper level, if we look past their apparent violence and cruelty, a way of serving justice as it was understood back then. And interestingly, justice often comes back in the Roman comments about the games. When at war, a soldier was made prisoner instead of fighting to the death, this was considered dishonorable, a disgrace, because the soldier had accepted defeat. So when this foreign soldier was turned into a gladiator, using this life that he had dishonorably kept, he was given a chance to rehabilitate himself, either by dying in the arena, which this time was a respectable death, or by winning and finally deserving this life. When people were condemned to death in the arena, it was literally justice being served in front of everyone, and at the same time a warning delivered to all who may want to break the law. Even in a regular combat, the belief that the gods or the natural divine forces of destiny gave victory to the most deserving was widespread. And it also appeared in many different cultures, this belief that a duel between two persons was a way of serving justice, because the gods determined the winner. So here again, a just outcome. All of this to say that instead of seeing the games as only a cruel and decadent form of entertainment, we could also acknowledge that they had other functions, possibly as one of the mechanisms the Roman society had found to ensure its cohesion. And interestingly, the rise of the games happened as Rome outlawed human sacrifices, as if one could replace the other. The Romans were never big on human sacrifices. These were really rare and frowned upon. But in 97 BC, that is to say, just the time when funeral games with gladiators fights were reaching bigger and bigger proportions, human sacrifices were made illegal. Also, to signal an anecdote, the thumbs-up gesture is associated nowadays with approval, and people often believe that it was the sign an editor or an emperor would do to spare a losing gladiator's life. In reality, it was the opposite. The thumbs up sign was the green light to execute the loser, and the thumbs down or a closed fist was the order to spare him. The meaning of this gesture was reversed in modern times, and now thumbs up has become a positive sign, to the point that in movies like Gladiator, gladiators are spared with a thumbs up, because this is what everyone expects, but it's not historical. So, after this overview of the phenomenon of gladiators, let's take a look at the games themselves, and at the most famous arena where they took place, the Colosseum. In games as they took shape in the 1st century BC and the first decades of the Empire, gladiator fights were the main course, but there were other attractions. And between these attractions there were acts by acrobats or musicians. It was like a long variety show that lasted for several consecutive days, and people could go to the amphitheatre if they wanted to see it. Initially, these attractions were organized in the Forum, and later, due to their success, entire arenas, amphitheatres. Many were built in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, including the largest of all, the Colosseum in Rome, which took about 10 years and kept being modified in the following decades. From the start, the Colosseum was designed for games, for different attractions, and apart from its size, it also stands out for its ingenuity and engineering. The arena itself could be used for different types of attractions, with lifts that could bring the participants into the heart of the action, from several levels under the arena. It seems it could also be briefly filled with water to recreate mock sea battles. So as we said, gladiatorial contests were one of the main attractions, probably the most popular. But there were others that drew large crowds too. One was the venatio, or animal hunt. A great variety of wild beasts imported from the Middle East and Africa were brought to the arena, and hunters would fight or hunt them. These included bears, lions, tigers, ostriches, hippos, and even elephants or giraffes. To make the hunt more appealing, movable trees and buildings were installed into the arena. And there were straight-up executions that would take place during lunch intervals. They were not really attractions in their own right, but they would still be staged. And these public executions were called ad bestias, that is to say, those condemned to death would be sent into the arena, naked and unarmed, and the beasts would turn them to pieces. A rare and spectacular kind of show that apparently only happened at the beginning of the Colosseum and stopped later was the simulation of sea battles, the recreation of historical battles with galleys. Historians are not all convinced that the entire arena could be flooded, because it is unclear how it could have been made waterproof, knowing that there was plenty of void and different levels of machinery under it. So maybe only a floodable channel crossing the arena existed, but in any case, these mock battles happened. Yet another type of attractions held in the arena was the recreation of natural scenes, a simulation of a forest with real trees, bushes, and rocks, or other natural elements, that was elaborated by painters, technicians, and architects. These scenes could be used just to display a natural, exotic environment to the urban population of Rome, with animals, a kind of temporary zoo. Or it could be used as the backdrop for a venatio, a hunt, or a drama depicting episodes from mythology. So the Colosseum was the antique equivalent of a modern arena, an adaptable venue that can be used for sport games, concerts, and other types of shows. But what is the history of the Colosseum itself? As I told you, the need for a large amphitheatre in Rome appeared with the multiplication of games that were now dedicated to the imperial cult, to the emperors. The site where the Colosseum was built was very central, near the Forum. It used to be densely populated, but it had been devastated by a great fire in 64 AD, during the reign of Emperor Nero. Following the fire, Nero seized much of the area to build a vast complex called the Domus Aurea, an extravagant palace that didn't last long. It was torn down after the death of Nero. But a large bronze statue of Nero, a colossus, was preserved near the entrance of the Domus Aurea, and the name Colosseum would have come from that, from the statue. So the destruction of the Domus Aurea made the site available, and in the years 70 AD, under the Emperor Vespasian, construction began. A large treasure had just been seized in the Middle East after the First Jewish-Roman War. The Temple of Jerusalem, the Second Temple, had been looted, and the spoils were enormous. They funded a big part of the construction. So after about 10 years, the huge amphitheatre was finished. It may look round from the outside, but it is in fact oval, and it could receive up to 80,000 people after a new gallery was added to the top a few years after the inauguration. Structurally, the Colosseum has like an outer shell, an outer wall, and an inner wall, which has remained mostly intact, or at least standing, whereas only a section of the outer wall still exists. The building was used after the fall of the empire for storage. The vaulted spaces inside were rented as housing and workshops well into the Middle Ages, since the building still stood up. Also, after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, it was occasionally used as a quarry for stones, and it suffered damages from earthquakes. But still, after almost 2,000 years, it still stands up and gives an idea of how spectacular it was for ancient Romans. It was entirely of stone, concrete, and brick, with large galleries for circulation between the inner and the outer wall, and of course, all around the perimeter, enough space to seat tens of thousands of spectators, with a good view of what happened in the arena. Certain practices in modern stadiums already existed back then. For example, spectators were given tickets in the form of pottery shards with numbers that indicated in which section and which row they should sit. The best views were from special boxes where the emperor and his close followers and the Vestal Virgins, the priestess of goddess Vesta, could sit. The rest of the seating reflected social classes, which were always rigid and very explicit in Rome. Near the emperor's box was a platform for senators, who were allowed to bring their own chairs for comfort. And above them were different tiers that only members of a certain social class could occupy. First, one for non-senatorial nobles and knights, the equitus, the closest thing to an aristocracy in ancient Rome. Then there was a level for ordinary citizens, the plebeians, which was itself divided into a lower section for the rich, closer to the nobles and the arena, and a higher section for poor citizens. Also on that level were specific sectors for certain social groups, for example, soldiers on leave, priests, or foreign ambassadors. All of this to guarantee that each segment of society had its place, but also to prevent any mix-up between higher and lower social classes, which would have been inappropriate. And finally, on the last tier, on top of the building, there was a sector for the common poor or slaves, either seated on very steep wooden benches or standing up. By the late Western Roman Empire, when the last shows took place in the Colosseum, it was more than 300 years old, and apparently still in good shape. Like the Pantheon in Rome and many public works around the empire, Roman architecture and their science of building materials and techniques were able to erect extremely strong buildings that stood the test of time for centuries, even without maintenance. The Colosseum is made of limestone, of tuff, that is to say volcanic rock, and Roman concrete, faced with bricks for decoration. The outer wall was made of stone blocks that were set without mortar. They were held together with iron clamps for a total of about 300 tons of iron. 300 tons of iron is not a big deal nowadays for a large building, but 2000 years ago that was a huge quantity of metal. Only 1500 years later, when the Industrial Revolution began, was such a quantity of iron used again in a building. This, together with the size and the magnificence of the building, tells us of the prosperity, the advanced engineering, and the human resources the Romans had at their disposal. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, which happened at a time when Rome had lost its importance as a capital. The capital had been moved to Ravenna. The Colosseum had become almost useless. So as I told you, it was used for housing, shops and workshops in medieval Rome. It was damaged in 1349 by an earthquake, and at the time Rome was at a low point because the popes had been relocated to Avignon in the south of France. The population of Rome declined sharply. The region became insecure, and the Colosseum was finally abandoned by the public, even becoming a popular den for bandits. When the popes returned to Rome, and the city began to recover, to become a center of the arts and once again enjoy a certain prosperity by the years 1400 and 1500, the Colosseum was partly repaired and lost its bad reputation. But only in the 19th century was it restored, cleaned up, and reinforced where it could have collapsed, turning into one of the symbols of ancient Rome and a major tourist attraction, one that is often listed among wonders of the world. We have reached the end of our journey for tonight. You can now let go and fall asleep, or if you are not sleepy yet, you may pick another story from my library. I'll be back soon with another one, and in the meantime, sleep well, sweet dreams, au revoir.